in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, from landing ground to international airport, an illustrated history of Nicosia airfield.
Arising out of that project, I've started to look, how did the airfield come to be there? Why was it there when the war began? And what happened to it after the war ended? From that has grown a study into the whole life of the airfield, and indeed aviation in Nicosia, which arguably stretches back almost a century.
Dr Brenda Davies returns to the island for a series of workshops in all the major towns.
And so I think that talking about parenting and having a forum to ask questions, which is what we're doing, having a forum to ask questions about parenting, is really good. But I like to extend that and look at the fact that we might be parenting our children, and we might find ourselves in a position where we also have to parent our elderly parents. But what we forget about is parenting ourselves. And so for me, it's really important that I look after me so that I can look after my children, and I look after me when my parents were around so I could then give them time. So I'm also looking at us parenting ourselves too.
And we meet the new British High Commissioner Ric Todd.
Although you can look back at the past, which helps you explain where you've got to where you are, the past is important, but even more important is the future. And I think it is the future in the 21st century that people should be looking towards. And in Cyprus, I think it's one of the most important single issues Cyprus faces is how a settlement to the Cyprus problem can be found.
The Centre for Visual Arts and Research in Ermou Street in Old Nicosia is the venue for a lecture on the first airports and planes of Cyprus. It's happening on November the 24th, and the speaker is Tim Reardon, who joins us now. Tim, where does the interest in the airports and planes of Cyprus come from?
Well, I've been working for some years now on a project to look at the history of Cyprus during the Second World War. During the war, the airfield at Nicosia was the primary military installation on the island, and arising out of that project, I've started to look, how did the airfield come to be there? Why was it there when the war began? And what happened to it after the war ended? From that has grown a study into the whole life of the airfield, and indeed aviation in Nicosia, which arguably stretches back almost a century.
And is now, of course, non-existent just about. I mean, you've obviously been up to the old Nicosia airport. What strikes you when you do go in?
The airfield now is a preserved open-air museum. There's wartime defences still present, some fantastic civic architecture from the 1940s, as well as the 1960s concrete terminal building that everybody knows.
Which again is in total disrepair. I mean, as a historian, would you like to see the place somehow restored?
My view is that the airfield is probably too small. The runways are too short to ever be recreated as a functioning airport. But as a collection of buildings, as an example of architecture, indeed as a great big open space next to the built-up city of Nicosia, it's a wonderful place, and it would be great if the population were able to enjoy it.
When you give this talk, you're going to be obviously covering not just Nicosia Airport, if you're talking about the airports and the plains of Cyprus. Let's talk about the plains a bit. I mean, when you say the plains of Cyprus, what are we talking about there?
Everything from very small private aircraft flown by pioneers of aviation who visited the airfield in the 1930s, through to the wartime fighters, Hurricanes, Spitfires, and occasional bombers that used Nicosia during the Second World War, through to the aircraft of the RAF of the 1950s, and the early airliners of civil aviation, from which grew the jumbos and such of today.
And of course, which were hugely important to Cyprus back then. I mean, we're an island. Air travel has sort of turned the economy around and made the island very much more accessible. What was it like before we had air travel?
Well, Nicosia Airfield has been the island's gateway to the world for many years, and as early as I think 1946 and 1947, the number of passengers arriving by air was greater than the number of passengers arriving by sea. So the airfield has been the first thing on the island that many visitors will have experienced for years. And the smell, the air of it will have been the lasting memory, the introductory memory for so many visitors to the island.
Well, if you want to find out more, do join Tim Reardon on the 24th of November at the CVAR, the Centre for Visual Arts and Research at Ermous Street in Nicosia.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
Dr Brenda Davies is back in Cyprus from the 22nd to the 29th of November with a series of workshops covering lots of different things. One that is of particular interest perhaps to parents is questions and answers about parenting. We'll talk about the other one shortly, but Brenda, thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you.
Parenting is something that certainly until fairly recently people just assumed you had babies and you knew what to do.
Yes. And of course, instinctively, we kind of do know what to do. And yet we look around ourselves, I'm sure, and back at our own childhoods, and see that often parents fall into pitfalls, and we repeat the things that's happened to us, even though we said we never would. And so I think that talking about parenting and having a forum to ask questions, which is what we're doing, having a forum to ask questions about parenting, is really good. But I like to extend that and look at the fact that we might be parenting our children, and we might find ourselves in a position where we also have to parent our elderly parents. But what we forget about is parenting ourselves. And so for me, it's really important that I look after me so that I can look after my children, and I look after me when my parents were around, so I could then give them time. So I'm also looking at us parenting ourselves too.
When you say what you just said, I'm assuming, although it's probably unfair to do so, that you're talking mostly about the female parent, because women seem to have been brought up over the centuries with putting themselves last.
Mm-hmm. But I think that to some extent men do also, but to a lesser extent. But I do see lots of men who are working at jobs that they don't particularly like, and they go every single day so that they can put food on the table and look after their children, and actually they're not happy, they're not healthy, they probably drink too much, they don't take care of themselves. So I think it doesn't matter whether it's men or women, though I do agree that women are notorious for putting everybody else before themselves.
So how do you stop that? I mean, what do you deal with in these workshops?
Well, I like us to look at the fact that in growing up, ideally, we become our own loving parent. And so if we look at how we might be lovingly parenting our children, or how we might lovingly parent anyone, we could turn that on ourselves and have a look at which part of me is going to parent that part of me that might have felt abandoned or hurt or abused or lost or not knowing what to do. And so there's a part of me that's capable of parenting me so that my little child self can be okay and get on with what she needs to do, and my adult can walk out into the world and be powerful and committed and do all of the things that I need to do as an adult in the world, not worrying anymore about my child self that really needs to be looked after. And she behaves well. She stays where she's supposed to stay. She's quite a happy little girl. But if she's in trouble, it's the parent part of me that needs to look after her.
But it takes a particular type of courage, perhaps, to recognise that the child part has a problem to deal with.
I think maybe it takes courage, but I usually find that people are quite astonished to even think that they have a child part, that there's still part of them that needs care. And sometimes doesn't need care, but also needs a little bit of reining in sometimes. I often use this when I like to write in the mornings, and I've got patients starting at 9 o'clock, and my little girl self is having such a good time. And my parent self says, Brenda, come on, patience in 10 minutes. And my little girl self says, well, just another 5 minutes. And then my parent eventually says, now it's time to get up, leave the writing, go and put the lipstick on. And so I get up and do that, and then my adult walks out looking good, feeling great, being all of the things that I need to be as an adult, while these two are sorting themselves out in the background.
Tell me about the other workshops you're doing while you're here, because you've got workshops across the island, haven't you?
Yes, I have, all sorts of places this time, which is lovely. I wanted to do whatever people want to do. What they feel they want and what they feel they need.
So is this feedback from your last visit?
Yes, it is. A lot of it. And so my organisers also talk to people and see what they would like. And the first time I came, I did a morning of questions and answers, which was very lively and very beautiful, and it's where I like to work anyway. And I said that this time I would do mainly questions and answers, so people can actually guide the workshop themselves by the questions that they ask. And so I'm doing things on symptoms, so people can come along with, an ache in your knee or a pain in your back, or the fact that your marriage is in a mess and that's the symptom in your life, or whatever. And then I encourage people to look at the fact that we have symptoms as a kind of final message to us that there's something not right. And what we do is we go back and have a look at whatever trauma it was that still is not healed, that's now produced this symptom. And so, as a doctor, I always feel, if we go back and we look at the trauma and we look at the cause of the symptom, then the symptom will often take care of itself and go away. Not always, but often. So I'm going to be doing people having questions and answers about their health, their marriage, their life, their whatever, and us looking at it using that kind of model. Let's look and see what happened, how you got to here in the first place, how you got to this painful part in your life, and see what we can do. And because I like to work with energy, I'll be doing energy diagrams. I like to give people a visual of their lives in energetic terms that they can then have a look at, and I play with it while we're in the workshop. So I'm doing that.
You've done all of these sort of things before. Can you give us an example of a success story working like this?
Oh, gosh, lots.
I'm sure. Pick one of your favourites.
Depends upon how adventurous I can be. But let me be fairly adventurous, because I think that this is something that moves me greatly. Years and years ago, I was teaching in Australia, and I was doing this, and a man came in and he had terrible arthritis in his hands, in both hands. And he said it had been fairly rapid onset, and he could hardly move his hands. He couldn't use his knife and fork anymore, and things like that. But when I looked at his energy, the thing that drew me most was the energy of his heart. And so I asked him to tell me about his heart. And it turned out that about 4 years before, he'd had a heart transplant. And the heart he'd had transplanted was from a 19-year-old who was killed on a motorbike. And prior to that, this young man had had another accident in which he had damaged both of his hands. And the young boy had a lot of pain and arthritis in his hands. And so we went back and looked at how this man felt about having the heart of a young boy who obviously had to die for him to have the new heart. And so we dealt with all of that. It was very, very moving and very beautiful. and we dealt with it all. This was the very first workshop of that tour. And he came about 3 days later to about the fourth workshop of the tour and said, I want to say something, and stood up and moved his fingers and moved his hands. And he said, from the time that we did that, and he gave thanks to the young boy who had died for him to live, his hands had got better and he was fine.
That's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is. It is. And it's not about me. It's not about me at all. It's not me telling a story of a miracle that I did. It's much more about healing and trauma and this man's pain and guilt and shame that he'd taken this young boy's heart.
Extraordinary. Brenda, you've got, as we said, a lot of workshops coming up. Can you sort of tell us where and when and how people can get in touch with you, and how do they book?
Right. Well, I have wonderful organisers all over the place. I've got Tatsi Joyce, who's just wonderful, and her number should be on here somewhere. I haven't got my glasses on.
Okay, let's have a look there. 99667039.
Right.
And there's Sue, 99622504. Or in the north, people can email Zehra Nalbantoglu. That's ZEHRA .Nal NALBANTOGLU @emu.edu.tr. And those workshops running, as we said, in Famagusta, in Limassol, in Nicosia, in Paphos even, and in Larnaca, between Saturday the 22nd and also the 29th of November. You've also got a Facebook page, so I think if people look for Dr Brenda Davies with an IES at the end, or go to www.brendadavies.com.
Yeah, that's lovely. And then I'm doing one much more kind of traditional workshop, which is Healing Relationships with Love and Peace, which is the title of this tour, which is looking at our relationship with ourselves, with our children, with our families, with our parents, with our husbands, wives, whatevers, and also with what I call the divine, you might call God, and with the planet and with life in general. And that's hopefully being able to do a lot of healing for all of that. And with Cyprus.
We still hope for the healing for Cyprus.
Absolutely.
Brenda Davies, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Rosie. Lovely to talk to you too.
A reminder that this is the Cyprus News Digest, going out on 106.3 FM in Ayia Napa. You can find it online at mycyradio.eu, and if you miss it, you can hear it again via the link on the Cyprus Mail website, or download it directly from iTunes. It also goes up on my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and look for Rosie Charalambous. The new British High Commissioner to Cyprus arrived in August, and he joins us on the Cyprus News Digest. He is Damien Roderick Todd, but I think, Rick, you prefer to be known just as Rick.
Yeah, I'm known as Rick. I'm known to Damien only to my mother.
I think we've all got names like that, haven't we?
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit first about your career before you arrived in Cyprus, because I think you served in Poland and the Turks and Caicos Islands. That must have been interesting.
Yeah. I've done an interesting variety of things. I'm actually a career civil servant. I joined the Foreign Office in 1980, so that was 34 years ago, when I was just 21. And I started off in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa. And then I went in the late 80s to Soviet-occupied Central Europe. I was in Czechoslovakia. And then I've done a lot of Central Europe since then, Germany, Slovakia, and Poland, as you said. But my last job was quite different from everything and anything I'd done before. I was governor of the Turks and Caicos Islands, which is in the Caribbean. It's a British overseas territory, 32,000 people spread over 30 islands, 7 of them inhabited. So a very beautiful and interesting place.
And now you're in Cyprus at, well, it seems every time I interview a new British High Commissioner, we say it's at an important point in Cyprus history, particularly with respect to the Cyprus problem. What are your aims while you're here? I mean, I'm sure you've got your instructions from the Foreign Office, but what do you personally want to achieve?
Well, I think there are 3 things I'd really like to achieve here in Cyprus, apart from my desire to get to know Cyprus and Cypriots, to travel across the islands and to learn more about this quite fascinating and unique history and culture of Cyprus, but the three professional things I want to do. I mean, first, I want to do everything which I can, which the British government can, to bring about a settlement of the Cyprus problem. Everyone agrees that a settlement of the Cyprus problem will be good for Cypriots, it will be good for Cyprus, it will be good for Greece and for Turkey, for the region, it will be good for Europe. So there's a very strong, I think, desire by the part of all the players, the protagonists, if you will, to work for that solution. And we have a new UN envoy, Mr. Ida, who's working very hard on this. So that's the first objective, to try and help bring about a settlement. Although I preface that by saying I hope that we see this very much as a problem which can be resolved really only by Cypriots, because it is Cypriot leaders who will have to reach a settlement by means of negotiation, and then Cypriot voters, Turkish Cypriot, Greek Cypriot, will have to agree that settlement in a referendum, and then Cypriots together will need to work out what is the next chapter in this island's story. So that is my first objective, I think, to try to help bring about a settlement. Second, as you know, there are on Cyprus sovereign bases, and this for me is a reflection of the fact that Britain and Cyprus have a very long and interesting and important shared history. Any history, especially when Britain was the colonial power, is going to be difficult at times. There are good parts, less good parts in that history. There are controversial elements to it. And I think that history has created two very important things. First, it's created a really strong relationship in human terms between Britons and Cypriots. And it's created almost a unique set of human relationships between Britain and Cyprus. So that colonial history, that history has also created some emotions, there's no doubt about it. I think we should talk about these issues, but I don't regard emotions as bad in human life, in diplomacy or in politics. So what I would like to do is to take the sovereign base areas, to take Cyprus's desire to be part of the solution to the problems Europe faces, and to work together on regional issues as partners, Britain and Cyprus in the 21st century. And third, coming back to this point about the links between humans, which matter so very much. I think human ties are far more important than meetings of diplomats or foreign ministers. Between Britain and Cyprus, we have a very strong trading relationship. I'd like to build that trading relationship. I'd like to have more human contacts, and I'd like to develop Britain and Cyprus as partners inside the EU, particularly on a series of important economic issues such as competitiveness, the single market, how we deal with trade, climate change. There's a whole set of very important economic issues where Britain and Cyprus have shared interests and shared values, and where we can work together.
And talking of those shared interests and helping, I think one of the areas that certainly the previous High Commissioner was working on was helping with the reform of our civil service here, which is obviously a very high priority if we're to exit the Memorandum of Understanding.
I think Cyprus has been through a very difficult economic period. What happened in 2013 was very difficult for Cyprus and for Cypriots. There's been GDP has fallen in Cyprus, unemployment has risen, many people have suffered from the economic crisis. I'm very pleased, although I should say not at all surprised, but I'm very pleased that at this moment when Cyprus had a very difficult time, Britain and Cyprus stood together, and I'm very glad that Britain was able to help and work with Cyprus. And as I see it, I want us to continue doing that. We are looking for partners in the EU, friends, allies, partners, and I want us to work together with Cyprus and with Cypriots to make Cypriots, and I don't want to sound selfish about this, to make Cyprus a better partner for us, and I want us to be a better partner for Cyprus. So the work we're doing through the National School of Government with some ministries in Cyprus is a part of that, because I want to pick up the point President Anastasiades made when he was in London in January. He said at a speech to the London School of Economics, he said he wanted Cyprus to be seen not as a problem, but as part of the solution to the problems which Europe faces, and that's very much the way I see Britain and Cyprus working together.
You mentioned the history, and of course I'm sure you will have already come across some Cypriots who very much blame the United Kingdom for the role it's played in where we are today. What's your answer to that?
I think that history is extremely interesting. I'm a history student. For me, talking about history is, apart from being important, about the best fun going. I think, though, although you can look back at the past, which helps you explain where you've got to where you are, the past is important, but even more important is the future. And I think it is the future in the 21st century that people should be looking towards. And in Cyprus, I think one of the most important single issues Cyprus faces is how a settlement to the Cyprus problem can be found. I also, in my limited time in Cyprus, it's been made clear to me just how very strong the emotions and the feelings are across the island of Cyprus. Turkish Cypriots, Greek Cypriots have very strong memories of what has happened. Those are very important. But again, what matters is the future and what we do now.
Which brings us on to communication strategies. You held a seminar recently with the media and with experts that you brought from the UK. And I seem to remember reading somewhere that you said at that seminar that it was important to be honest and transparent, and that though, in effect, it may not win you many friends, you were more likely to be unpopular if you tried to hide the truth.
I think the seminar we had was an interesting occasion. It arose from a conversation which President Anastasiades had when he was in London in January, and we agreed it would be very helpful to get together government communicators here in Cyprus and some experts from the UK and talk about how you go about the business of communicating as a government in the 21st century. I do feel, and I remember this from my time as governor of the Turks and Caicos Islands, it is important to communicate with citizens, and I feel, to my experience, that citizens actually do like honest communication from their government. Honest first in the sense that you tell the truth, but honest also in the sense that you don't try to conceal that truth. You don't try to tell people what they want to hear. People are well able to understand complicated situations, to understand choices, and I think it's the right approach for government is to set out honestly what the choices are and what the issues are. And I also think that a government does need to communicate all the time. Communicating honestly doesn't guarantee you popularity, but if you don't communicate openly and honestly, I think it guarantees you unpopularity.
And of course, I think in this day and age it's fair to say that gone are the days when people say, oh, I read it in the newspaper so it must be true. We have the internet, we have bloggers, we have so many different areas that we can access to get the other side of the story. Where does spin come in on all of this? Because all governments are still at it, and yet they don't seem to realise that most people now see through it.
Well, I think the word spin was quite associated with a particular era in British politics and a particular sort of relationship, perhaps you might call it, between government and the media. You are right that in the 21st century people have many sources of information other than the newspaper, the TV or the radio, and therefore people are more likely to seek a range of views and to get their experiences and their information from other sources. So when I joined the Foreign Office in 1980, you might communicate by issuing a press release. Well, you still issue press releases 35 years on, but that's not the end of your communication. But I am sure that what people most value is communication which is direct and which is clear and which is put to them in ways where they find it interesting to hear. And one of the points about why the electronic media is so important is because it can be much more immediate. You can have videos, you can have pictures, you can have images, and it also encourages people to summarise clearly what it is they are trying to say. I think, although I would say on the other hand, that in some senses people now are overwhelmed with information, and it's not always easy to judge the quality of the information you are getting. And the internet is a marvellous place to get information, but to believe what you hear on the internet is a bit like believing the person who shouts loudest in the Dog and Duck. So you have to, I think the intelligent person now does apply his or her own filter to what they see in the internet. And government's job, I think, is to try to explain things honestly and simply and clearly. And that will be, it won't be the end of the story, but it'll be a major part of building understanding between government and citizens, which is so important.
And do you think that change in the way we consume media has in any way impacted on the way the government communicates with the media?
Well, the government, the government in the UK, the present government, previous governments, I'm sure the next government will devote great attention to communicating. And I don't think we should see this as inevitably somehow spinning or somehow dishonest. All governments will want to put across what they're doing and why. But don't forget, government communication is a lot more than the Prime Minister saying what he thinks should happen or the Chancellor interpreting the latest economic data. It's also about how you put across to citizens very difficult messages like try to have a healthy lifestyle, drugs are bad for you, if you do your homework and work hard, you're more likely to get a good job. So these are sort of also, in a sense, very valid messages which any government puts across, along with how to avoid fires and the dangers of speeding. So government communication goes much wider than what you might think of as a purely political communication. But equally, if you want to have a discussion with people in Cyprus or in Britain about how to fund the health service, how to deal with the fact that the population is ageing, what policies do you need to have in place to encourage education and training and skills building among young people, you have to have a dialogue about that. And you have to try to set out what the problems are and what the possible solutions are. And that, I think, is what people want.
It's a pleasure talking to you. That is the new British High Commissioner to Cyprus, Ric Todd.
Thank you.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.